Welcome to Clothesline Theatre. We have been waiting for you to tune in to hear tales of Prince Edward Island, a place of history and some mystery. You may be surprised by the true stories that have been unearthed and brought to life by our radio dramas. We invite you to settle into a comfortable chair and let the voices and sounds trigger your imagination as you hear the following dramatic story.
Winters can be cold on the Isle of Prince Edward. Before the days of fiberglass and styrofoam insulation, islanders resourcefully used the seaweed that storms washed up from the bottom of the sea to bank the foundations of their homes throughout the winter months. It was effective in cutting down the drafts of winter winds and reducing the biting cold.
Morning there, Robert. I see we both have the same idea. The missus said if I don't get down to the shore today and collect that seaweed to bank our house, I would be spending the winter in the doghouse.
The weather's been so good this fall, George, it's hard to believe it's already the 9th of November. A snowstorm could come in any day now, and an on-bank house would make for a long, bitter cold winter.
Well, now, since you're getting married in a few weeks, Robert, I doubt if it'll be a cold winter in your house. Seaweed or no seaweed.
That's my hope, George, but I don't want to give Alice any reason for complaint starting off, so I plan to bank the house right up to the bottom of the windows.
Good idea. Just be sure to get it taken away in a timely fashion in the springtime and worked well into the garden. That will score you a few smiles.
No worries about that. I've never seen anything as good as seaweed to lighten and mellow the soil. I believe it keeps the bugs down in the summer as well. Not much in life is free, but seaweed is placed right there at our feet. A right good gift from the sea.
Oh, you'll get no argument from me on that one. I'd say we both have a full load. Likely see you back here in an hour for another. This job is going to eat up our day.
And with that, Robert started back to his home on that Thursday morning in November of 1912. He was seated on the load, letting his horse drive herself and thinking about nothing in particular, when suddenly he saw his sister-in-law, Mrs. John Phillips, standing in the front door of her house on Russell Street, calling out to him.
Robert! Robert, come quickly! Silas Clark has a gun and is threatening to shoot me!
What? Are you serious?
Robert jumped down from the load and was starting towards the front door of his brother's home when Silas Clark, the next-door neighbor, suddenly appeared, aiming a gun at Robert's head.
Now, Silas...
Robert Phillips had only a moment to turn his head to the side before Silas fired. Surprise and pain flashed across his face as he staggered towards the house, bleeding profusely from his neck. After a few steps, he fell to the ground. Fidel Gallant witnessed the shooting, but fearful for his life, quickly ran away. Having heard the sound of a gun being discharged, a crowd quickly gathered in front of the homes of John Phillips and Silas Clark.
Dear God, Robert Phillips has been shot.
Quick, Alex, run for Dr. Tanton. I saw him go into the Allen house at the end of the street just minutes ago. He should be still there. You men, don't just stand there. Carry Robert into John's house.
Where is Silas?
I believe he went into his house!
Silas Clark had indeed entered his home to be greeted by Mrs. Clark.
Silas, what is happening? What is all the commotion outside? Why do you have a gun?
I shot Bob Phillips. I'm awful sorry. I must go to my room.
Silas, is it bad?
I just wanted to scare him.
Silas!
Meanwhile, Dr. Tanton had arrived at the house of John Phillips. After examining Robert, he ordered his removal to the newly opened Prince County Hospital for treatment.
Is it as bad as it looks, Dr. Tanton?
Well, there are 7 shot in his neck, 3 of them dangerously near the jugular, but we have stopped the hemorrhaging. I believe it is best if we just cleanse the wounds and wait to see what happens. If there's any sign of blood poisoning in the next several days, we will be forced to remove the shot. For now, we hope for the best.
Back at the scene of the crime, the crowd surrounded the house of Silas Clark.
Well, someone has to go in after him.
If a man could do a cold-blooded thing, such as Clark is accused of doing, he would certainly not hesitate to use his gun on anyone who tries to bring him to justice.
Magistrate McQuarrie, who was out of town, was communicated with by phone and informed of the situation. He ordered the arrest of Clark, and policeman Steele was sent to do the job.
Clark, open the door. It will go better for you if you do.
There was only silence in response. A young man named Jack Ryan decided to enter the house.
Mr. Clark, you need to come out now.
Get out of my home. Get out, I tell you.
Policeman Steele made good of the opportunity offered by Ryan's presence to enter the residence. Upon seeing the policeman, Clark went for his gun behind the door, but Steele poked a revolver under Clark's nose, bringing the man to his senses and total surrender. He was handcuffed and taken to jail. 28-year-old Robert Phillips recovered and was ready to testify at the trial of Silas Clark on November 30th. The courtroom was packed with spectators who wanted to know why Silas Clark had shot Robert Phillips.
Order in the court. Order, I say. The court will hear the case of Silas Clark charged with shooting with intent to do grievous harm. Mr. Justice Hazard presiding. J.E. Wyatt for the Crown. Albert Saunders for the defense.
Mr. Wyatt, you may commence with the Crown's case.
Crown's case is straightforward, Your Honor. If a man fires into a crowd, it is reasonable to suppose that he is going to do some harm, and he must be held responsible for the action. In this case, Phillips had seen Clark pointing something at him and had only time to remove his face sideways before the gun was discharged. Phillips did not think Clark would shoot him. He was wrong and received 7 shots to the neck. Clark and Phillips were known to each other. They had words at times and fought. Clark had more than once threatened to fix Phillips. This was not a random, innocent act on the part of Clark. I argue that Clark knew what he was doing when he pulled that trigger and is completely sane as anyone in the courtroom today. I call Phillips to the stand. Please tell the court your relationship with Mr. Clark.
I knew him from around town, and him being a neighbor of my brother. As a truck man, I know lots of people in town.
Is there animosity between you?
Well, there's been some ill feelings between us for about 5 years now.
And why would that be?
He's crazy. He had this ridiculous notion in his head that our family was tormenting him and out to get him. All we did was tease him a little. Lately, he's been home a lot instead of working, and he was out calling names at my sister-in-law.
Did your brother's children bother Mr. Clark?
Oh, they may have run after him at times and called him names, but nothing serious.
The Crown called a number of witnesses who testified about the bad blood between Clark and the Phillips brothers. It was recorded that Clark attempted to have the law take action against the Phillips for their harassment of him. All had agreed Clark was perhaps unstable in mind. The prosecution then rested its case. Mr. Saunders, in opening his defense of the prisoner, briefly addressed the jury.
Let me tell you about my client. Silas Clark is a hard-working man of 40. He moved to Summerside from Union Corner and worked his way up from a laborer to a full carpenter. His life since moving to Summerside has not been easy. He has suffered greatly at the hands of boys who have tormented and laughed at him. John Phillips' boys were among them, as was Robert Phillips himself. It played on Clark's mind. Hoping to put a stop to the annoyance, he went among Summerside's lawyers to complain and seek help. Seeing that no one would help to stop the harassment, he was driven crazy. Imagine living with torment day upon day and realizing that no one was willing to give a hand in stopping it. When Clark saw Robert Phillips near his house on Russell Street on that day, he was filled with fear. He had reason to be scared, for Phillips had long called him names, and only the previous May had struck Clark and went off laughing about it, and including the threat to kill the man. Mr. Clark has been continually harassed and has tried every means to stop it, including writing to the Attorney General, who never responded, although he is in the courtroom today pushing forward the charges against my client. Yes, Clark fired the gun, but not with the intent to harm, but rather with the intent to scare, so that he would be left alone. Under the circumstance, it is reasonable to conclude that at the time of the shooting, Silas Clark was not mentally responsible for his actions. The defense witnesses will verify all of which I have spoken.
Witnesses for the defense included Silas, Mrs. Clark, his employer Donald Morrison, and lawyers he had consulted about his problems. They all told of the harassment of Silas Clark and their belief of his mental instability. The trial was swift, both sides resting their cases within hours. Justice Hazard addressed the jury before they retired for deliberation.
There is no doubt as to the act of shooting. The only question is the sanity of the prisoner. He appears as rational on the witness stand as any other witness. If capable of knowing the difference between right and wrong, the prisoner is responsible. The jury may retire.
The jury took little time in deliberation and once again took their seats in the courtroom.
Has the jury reached a decision?
We have, Justice Hazard.
Please read it to the court.
We find Silas Clark guilty of shooting with intent to do grievous bodily harm. However, under the circumstances, we add a recommendation for mercy. For did not the victim play a hand in his own shooting? No doubt, many in the courtroom today will leave here with a guilty conscience.
Point well made. I sentence Silas Clark to 2 years imprisonment in Dorchester Penitentiary for the shooting of Robert Phillips.
Oh, Silas, please, no, no!
On April 11th, 1914, the Pioneer newspaper printed the following story. A telegram received by Messrs. Holman Limited announces that Silas H. Clark of Summerside died of paralysis at Dorchester Penitentiary on Friday morning. The deceased, it will be remembered, was sentenced at the Supreme Court in Summerside in November 1912 to 2 years in Dorchester for shooting Mr. Robert Phillips, who was not very seriously injured, however. His death is particularly sad at this time, as a strong movement was on foot in the hope of his release on parole, with considerable prospect of success. Silas Clark is buried beside his parents in a cemetery at Union Corner. Silas Clark shoots Robert Phillips. Who's the real victim? Narrator, Stuart Smith. George, Wayne Wright. Robert Phillips, Dan Casely. Mrs. John Phillips, Charmaine Comeau. Woman 1, Kathy Clow. Woman 2, Sheila Young. Woman 3, Patty Arsenault. Mrs. Silas Clark, Catherine Dixon. Silas Clark, John Martin. Nurse, Dolly Silk. Dr. Tanton, Jim Dixon. Young Fellow, Sean Ramsey. Policeman, Paul McWilliams. Bailiff, Enzer Waite. Judge Hazard, Roger Ahern. Mr. Wyatt, Albert Goody. Mr. Saunders, Ken Gay. Jury Foreman, Stephen Hurst. Musician, Christine Anderson Gallant. Sound Foleys, Krista Bryson, Alexandra Gallant, Nathan Wiley. Recording Artist, Peter Gallant. Writer, Marlene Campbell. Researcher and Editor, Jean McKay. Introduction, Lowell Eustis. This radio drama is brought to you by Wyatt Heritage Properties, Inc. through support from the Building Communities through Arts and Heritage Funding Program of the Department of Canadian Heritage and the Province of Prince Edward Island and the City of Summerside.